Jazakallah khair, attending this evening. Many, I think, in this audience would be familiar with recent milestones or um, significant anniversary in history related to the Muslim world. In I think one area we are familiar with in case of Pakistan. So Pakistan has reached its 75th year of its existence. It was created in 1947. So often when we discuss issues which affect us, we tend to look at the history or the period we are familiar with. So last 75 years. So and often in Pakistan, for example, we might discuss the period of democracy, dictatorship rule, and you analyze how long dictatorship lasted, how long democracy lasted. You look at maybe what happened since Pakistan's creation, issues it had with India and everything. But the point is, this is not just our history. This is not just the Muslim Ummah's history or the Ummah in Pakistan history. Our history is greater than this. It's much more in depth than this. As Muslims, our history goes back for almost 1400, more than 1400 years, almost 1400 Gregorian years. And as we know, Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Islam came, and a system or a state was started around the year 622, 623. And this system continued. Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam established the system in Medina, and upon Hijrah, Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was still a Nabi, still giving revelation. But now, upon Hijrah, upon settling Medina, a state was founded. So Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam now was head of this state. He was now a ruler. And after Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's time, there were rulers who succeeded him, khilafah, meaning successors in ruling to Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And
the whole history.
No problem. I'm going to give a summary, inshallah. And so these successors, they continued for 1300 years. And this system of khilafat, this rule of the caliphs, this unfortunately finished in 1924 with the Uthmani khilafah. So this evening, Brother Yahya will, inshallah, elaborate upon the reasons why this system finished. What were the underlying causes towards the end of this period, and how does it relate to us today, and why we need to pay attention on reversing this process, and why the need to re-establish this political system of Islam, this Khilafat system of Islam, inshallah. So without further ado, Yahya, over to you, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wa salatu wa salam ala rasulil kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So Jazakallah khair, brother. He asked if he kind of he laid the foundation. You know, it's Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam established the state. Rahimallah, he passed away. The khulafa ruled after him, and we got to where we are today. But there was a lot that happened in between, and so I need to talk about some of the history. But I'm going to focus on what were the things that were going wrong, because we're not here just to talk about what a wonderful history we had. It was a long history, mashallah. There's lots of wonderful things, and we can cover that in other topics. How amazing the innovations of the Muslims were, the great creativeness of the Muslim Ummah, the ulama, and what they came up with. But today we're going to focus on what were the things that led us to where we are today. Okay, so you know, Islam, for all of that period, for 1342 years roughly, I think it is. You know, Islam was applied practically. Hijri years I'm talking about. Islam was applied practically in life. The judges ruled by it. The rulers ruled by it. It was referred to. The Islamic Sharia was referred to. So for all of that period, you can say that Islam was applied practically throughout the Muslim lands. And then, you know, 100 years ago, almost to the day, it just came to an end. It just stopped. The British invaded. You know, they took on. They basically occupied Istanbul. That was the end of Islamic rule, and then we've had 100 years without it. And so something happened in between. A lot of things happened in between, and it wasn't one factor. There's definitely not one thing you can point your finger at to say that is the cause. There was a number of it. It was a decline which happened early, and it culminated with the great defeat, the big disaster. And then we could say we've had an awful century since then. The last 100 years for Muslims has been the worst century you could imagine, without exception. There's been bad years, there's been bad decades, but we've had a bad century. Nothing has gone right for the Muslims. The point of saying that Islam was applied in life is because the Aqidah was the reference point. The belief in Allah, the belief in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the belief that Allah is al-Hakim, the ruler, the legislator, the belief that all of that Sharia must be applied, that is the basis from which you can say is life was Islamic or not Islamic. If there had been another Aqidah referred to, if somebody else's belief had influenced the way of life, you would say it's not Islamic. But if it's based upon Islamic Aqidah, even with all the difference of madhabs and difference of opinions and different ways of doing things and different rulings you can take from the same source, the Quran and Sunnah, the fact that the Quran was referred to, the fact that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the reference point, makes it Islamic. So for all of that period, you can say it was Islamic. Even though you find some individuals from amongst the rulers, and we've had many rulers, many khilafah, one after the other. There's been periods where they've competed against each other. There's periods when, the Baghdad was conquered, and then the khilafah was moved to another city, to Cairo, and then it was moved to another city, to Istanbul. And it's chaotic history. However, and in that period, you've had some bad rulers. You've had some rulers doing some terrible things. I mean, the British, they love to write books about the bad rulers and amplify and emphasize as if the whole century was terrible because this one ruler did one bad thing in that century. So we have a very distorted view of history. So I'm not here to discuss the history as is written in the Western history books, or even the history as is written in all of the biographies of those who love to praise the rulers, or the poetry of those who love to defame the one who's opposed to their favourite ruler. None of this is reliable sources of history. What we got is some facts, some information, some narrations. We've got a patchy view of what actually happened. However, there's some certain facts you can rely upon. You can go to the records, the judicial records in Al-Quds. You can go to Baghdad. You can go to Cairo. You can go through all of this. And you can see what the judges were judging by, because it's there in the court records. So you can see the reference point was Islam. And so even though we know some stories of bad rulers, those who even killed their own family in order to attain that ruling position, or to preserve their ruling position, of course that action is not legislated, it's not sanctioned in Islam. So that person did a sin, without a doubt, and he did a major sin, and it's a terrible act what he did. But that doesn't mean the whole city or the whole town or the whole country became un-Islamic. It means that man did something wrong, and all the other people, whether they condemned it or they didn't condemn it, whether they were in fear or not in fear, the important point was Islam was still the reference point, even though somebody did something bad. Al-Hajjaj, there's nobody can dispute Al-Hajjaj is one of the worst rulers we've ever had. He was, they said, if all the sins of mankind were put on one scale, and the sins of Hajjaj were put on the other, his sins would outweigh all of mankind's sins. It was so bad. He was the murderer of the Sahaba. Yet, still, that does not characterize the time immediately after the Sahaba when the greatest ulama were around. That does not characterize that period as being un-Islamic. Nobody has ever said that. Nobody said that Islam was not applied at that time, although that ruler was a bad ruler.
Yeah.
So, Islam, it brought something to the Arabs who had nothing prior to Islam. It transformed them. It made them establish their authority, their ruling with Islam from all the way in the north in Russia, all the way down to Tanzania in the south, all the way from Morocco in the west, all the way to Indonesia in the east. That is a huge portion of land. That is the majority of the known world at the time. The majority of the world where people inhabited was ruled with Islam, into China, into parts of Europe, up to the doors of Vienna. It was enormous. The Islamic lands were the lands which were ruled with Islam. So Islam brought something to the Arabs which helped them achieve this. And of course it was the belief in Allah, the belief in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the belief that they could build their life upon this. It wasn't just a spiritual belief. It wasn't belief in angels alone. It wasn't belief in, the afterlife and you just have to, you be aesthetic, you pray in your corner and you disregard life's affairs. That is not the Islamic belief. That is not the Islamic way of life. It was because they had confidence in the Sharia as being the best Sharia, the solution to all of the problems, and they had this message which they had to deliver to all of mankind to save as much as mankind as possible. That's what drove them to continue opening new lands, and for the people who had been conquered to then believe in it themselves and live and raise their own children with Islam. It was not spread by the sword in this hypocritical way where people confessed Islam but they hated it, in the way that the West today spreads their democracy with tanks and bombs and armies, and the people have to submit to it, but given the first chance, they reject it immediately. It's not like that. Islam was believed in. The very fact that we've got Muslims in the room today whose grandparents and great-great-great-great-grandparents converted to Islam and then taught their children it, and then taught their children's children it, it shows Islam was something we believed in and it was not enforced upon us. And the big point here is that Islam had the not only the convincing belief, but it gave the motivation for all of the people to adhere to it and to spread it. And it led to this Islamic state being the leading state for centuries. It was the state par excellence. There wasn't another state. Europe was dividing into many kingdoms. The rest of Africa was dividing into many, many villages and kingdoms. India at the time was in, kingdoms. Islam, its state was the powerful state. There was no state to rival it. And this went on for centuries and centuries and centuries. Now, this is part of the problem, is that the Muslims became to expect the other states to have no chance of competition. They had defeated the Persians, they had defeated the Romans, there really wasn't anything left. Europe, even though it was officially still part of the Roman Empire, it was divided, it was weak, it had no unity, it had no creativity, had no ability to do anything. And it was in a tumultuous state, Europe was. Just look at the history of any of the kingdoms of Europe, and you can see this was not a happy place to be for centuries and centuries. And the Muslims saw that, and they believed that we're always going to be better. And then when the change happened, when Europe suddenly rose from nowhere, it shocked the Muslims during the Uthmani time. The Ottoman time, the Muslims were shocked, and they were not able to deal with that. They were not able to handle that situation because they had relied upon the Europeans being so weak, and then suddenly they're not weak. Suddenly they're stronger than us. Suddenly they're taking away parts of our land. And so there's some very important factors we need to discuss which led to that particular occurrence. The enemies of Islam, they realize that the strength of Muslims, the reason why they are so powerful as an ummah is because they are an ummah. Because they all have the same belief. They all have the same reference point. They all work together. They have common goals and objectives. Just that alone is enough to make a nation strong. A people become strong because they have a common goal and a common objective. And if that common goal and common objective isn't just located and restricted to just that small group of individuals, it's something that other people can believe in and take on, then it grows and grows and grows. So it's the idea of Islam was the strength of Islam, and the idea that it can spread and solve all of world's problems for all of time. Well, the enemies realized that very early on, that this is their strength, and we need to find a way of weakening that hold on Islam, that belief. They realize they can't come with an alternate belief and say, here you go, we've got stronger proofs, you need to leave Islam. And they failed miserably at that. They couldn't bring their false beliefs because Islam always had the stronger proof. So instead they took a different approach. We can corrupt the belief of the Muslims. We can change the belief. We can change their understanding of Islam. We can change the link, the strength of the link between the belief and the way they live their lives. If we can do that, we can bring weaknesses into them. So one of the first attempts they made was to, play with the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to fabricate, to introduce new hadith, to change them. Well, alhamdulillah, the ulama of Islam, the muhaddithin, they exposed this pretty early on. Within the first couple of centuries, they started compiling the books of riwayat, of narrations, and the narrators, and the biographies of the narrators. And they would only accept the hadith which have got a strong chain of narration. You know who said to who heard from who, and what kind of trustworthiness is that person. And so that kind of resolved that problem. So the fabricated hadith were discarded. And now, alhamdulillah, we still, to this day, we can still have great confidence and reliance upon the hadith because they've all been graded and categorized. So that first attempt failed, but that was an early attempt. Then, the next port of, the next way that Islam started to, or the first signs of decline occurred within 100 years of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was to do with the Arabic language. The Arabic language is core to understanding Islam. You can't understand Quran in another language. You can't get a Persian translation and expect to understand it. It had to be Arabic. It was well understood by all of the early Muslims because they learnt Arabic, and all of the ulama, even if they were Persian origin, even if they were Uzbeki origin, even if they were from anywhere, they learnt Islam in Arabic. And they did their ijtihad, they derived rules in Arabic. So if weakness comes into Arabic, of course you've weakened the deen. Yeah. So Umar bin al-Khattab, he noticed weakness, and the early Muslims were strong on preserving the Arabic language. Ali bin al-Khattab, Ali bin Abi Talib was one of the first to write the rules of Arabic language down and to teach them and enforce them on people to learn them. Umar ibn al-Khattab was reprimanding people if he found they were making mistakes in Arabic, because he said it's very serious. There's one incident, it's interesting. He saw some Muslims doing archery and they were making mistakes. They were not very good at it. They were missing the target. And so, he reprimanded for about that. And they said, they replied to him, Inna qawmun muta'allameen. We are people who are learning. We're just students, we are people who are learning. But they made a mistake in their grammar. It should have been, Inna qawmun muta'allamoon. Yeah, and he rebuked them even worse. He said that, he basically said, by Allah, your tongue's mistakes are more severe than the mistakes in archery. He knew that he wants strong soldiers who are well trained, but he said it's worse that you make mistakes in the language. And he said, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Allah was merciful with a man whom he perfected his tongue. Rahimallahu imra aslaha min lisanihi. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had encouraged this. This was something they knew to be very important to preserving the deen. And they preserved it. But yet, over time, within 100 years, you started to see some weaknesses. You started to see mistakes in Arabic coming in. We don't have time to cover that. But by the 6th century, you found that even the wallah, the governors of the provinces of the Islamic state had grown so big. The governors, they were no longer conversant in Arabic. They knew Arabic in a relaxed way, in a kind of a colloquial way, but they were weak in understanding Arabic. To the point where even, this is the same period where they say the doors of ijtihad were closed. Because so many mistakes were coming into the ijtihad, into the deriving of rules from the lawyers, from the ulama, that the main ulama of the time decided, that's enough, we've got to put a stop to this. We can't allow this weakness coming in by mistakes, so we're now saying that is the end of ijtihad. We've covered all the issues, we now have all the rules, we don't need to, we won't allow anybody to come up with a new opinion. Just like you can say, we're not going to allow a new hadith that somebody found in Ilford. Oh, they were looking through a trunk, and then, I found a new hadith. Nobody can accept that. Why have we not heard this for 1300 years? It's acceptable to reject a new piece of information like that. They did the same with fiqh, with rulings, which is a disaster. Because if you think about it, when you do come across a new situation, like something the Europeans have revived, they've got new technology, what do? We don't have the tools anymore. We're now 800 years behind, and we don't have the ability to even, go to the Quran and Sunnah to derive a rule and say, should we or shouldn't we accept that new piece of technology? Should we or shouldn't we accept this new idea? Should we work with them or work, what is the Islamic ruling on so many issues? We didn't know, because we'd lost that ability 800 years prior to that. Even though it was done in the defense of Islam, actually it was one of the major factors which weakened us. But also, the thoughts of Islam, the Aqidah itself came under attack. So the enemies of Islam, they saw, Hindu philosophy, Muslim philosophy, Muslims' way of viewing life, Hindus' way of viewing life. Hindus are spiritual. They reject the dunya. Muslims prioritize the akhirah over the dunya. They're the same. So they started to bring, of course it's not the same, but they try to imply it's the same. So therefore the ideal Muslim became the ascetic, in the way the ideal Hindu is the one who punishes himself the most in this life because he's expecting something better in his next life. The ideal Muslim is the one who denies the dunya the most because he's expecting something better in the akhirah, in the next life. And they made these false equivocations. They saw similarities and they came up with new conclusions. And so the ideal Muslim became like the spiritual guy, the one who is disassociated from life. So even if the rulers are killing themselves, he doesn't have a comment on that. He's not interested. He said, these are affairs of dunya, I'm only interested in akhirah. And even though his words are partially true, but he's allowing corruption. He's allowing, he's allowing crimes to happen. So he's no longer forbidding the munkar, even though the command was to forbid the munkar. The munkar happens in front of him. He says, I'm elevated high above this. I'm on a different level. This is a dunya matter. I'm on a spiritual level. And so he, out of arrogance, unfortunately, he's allowed himself to leave large portions of the deen from his life because he's got this false philosophy. But these are the enemies of Islam who started to make these equivocations, these analogies. And this went on for centuries. So this isn't an overnight thing. This is something which happened over a long period of time. But we did something else to ourselves early on. The Abbasids took power from the Umayyads. The Umayyads are the ones who, the khilafah Umayyah, is the people who came immediately after, Uthman radiallahu anhu, and they from Muawiyah, Muawiyah was the first to introduce his son as the next ruler, and he did it by force and by trickery. From then on, all rulers became hereditary. So the best person was not chosen as ruler, just the person who's born into the right family. The Abbasids took power by force. The Banu Abbas, they wanted to bring ruling back to Banu Hashim, but they did it by force, and they did it through this hereditary way, by continuing ruling in this way. And they involved the Muslim Ummah in cheap struggles over ruling rather than focusing on spreading Islam to the world. So you found that the conquest for Islam, they pretty much stopped once the Abbasids came to power, because everybody's focused now on what's going on in Baghdad. They're not focusing on what's going on in the borders. They're focusing on preserving the seat of the Khalifa, and they're not focused on spreading Islam to the rest of the world. What are the Romans up to? What's going on, beyond what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa? Islam didn't spread any further because it stopped. And then you got two Khalifas, one in Spain, one in Baghdad. And then you had the Fatimids coming on, again trying to claim that they're kind of bringing ruling back to Banu Hashim, but the Ummah is now accepting division. And then you started to see the state fragmenting, to the point where we had many statelets. They gave, officially they're part of the Islamic State. They didn't compete with the Khalifa in terms of his title, but in reality they're semi-autonomous, more or less, or given a lot of autonomy. Well, this is our weakness. Even though we're strongest than any other state, and this is the period of the absolute strength of the Khilafah and the Muslim Ummah at that time, yet we were able to lose. They were able to pick away parts of the Islamic lands. Why? Because we weren't unified in the way we should be unified. We still had some unity, but not enough. And we weren't gathering around correcting the ruler when he made mistakes. So this continued for a number of centuries. And then the Ottomans came, the Uthmani Khilafah, it unified a lot of these disparate lands, it conquered them back for Islam, and then it started to bring back the spirit of jihad and spreading Islam into the new lands. So Islam spread into the Balkans, it spread past Greece, it went as far as Vienna, as we said. And this absolutely petrified and frightened the Europeans. And it kind of gave them a kick up the backside to wake up. Suddenly they're now talking about the Eastern question. Suddenly they're now focused, the Europeans are focused on what's going on over there. And it was frightening to them, to the point, and it coincided with the time when they're having their renaissance anyway. They're starting to, have their own kind of revival of thinking. Their philosophers, their thinkers, their writers are encouraging people to be creative, to have a new way of looking at life, to have a new way of looking at judicial affairs, of political affairs, to start to claim you have some rights and the king no longer has absolute authority. All of this change was happening in Europe. Is a very, very big change, and it led ultimately to their revival. So they started to rise, and they saw a serious threat from the Ottomans, from the Uthmanis. So even though the Khilafah Uthmaniyya was still spreading lands, and it was the powerful army, there was no army, the Europeans had no chance of defeating it, but the Uthmani Khilafah was not aware of its own weaknesses. It was looking only at its military strength, and it wasn't aware of its intellectual weakness. It wasn't even aware that it had no ability to do, judicially, it was stagnant. It had no ability to derive new rulings on new affairs, but then it didn't really expect there to be many new affairs. So they kind of dug their own grave. And then suddenly the Europeans did stand up, and that just sent the Ottomans into a tailspin. They didn't know what to do. But there's some details, and I'm just going to very, very quickly summarize that it wasn't like the Europeans are doing something over there and the Ottomans are over here and they're hardly talking in between. No, there was lots of communications. The Europeans started to make ways into the Ottoman lands. They started to feel the threat and feel they wanted to do something about it. They started to revive their idea of missionary, which is their version of dawah. So they started their missionary societies to enter into the Muslim lands, and they set up a base in Malta, and they started to use that as a way of coming into the Levant, Syria, Sham, Lebanon didn't exist at that time, but that area, Palestine. And so they had previously led many crusades trying to take the land, and they did occupy a large portion of Palestine and Lebanon for 100 years, but ultimately they were kicked out. They failed. Why? Because they were failed rulers. It didn't satisfy the people threw them out ultimately, because they had relied upon the Christians of the area thinking that they would support them, but they didn't. The Christians of the area, the Arab Christians, were more, they preferred for the Muslims to rule over them because they were more just and kind than the European crusaders. So they found no support when they got there. Now, they tried to reverse that. They tried to now build some support, some loyalty. And it was a long, slow process. And they didn't achieve a lot of success. They weren't able to convince Muslims to become Christians. They weren't able to, to even contact many of the Arab Christians. But they just needed ones and twos, just a few to start the ball rolling. And this is what they did. So they started to do that. And it led to ultimately, they managed to gain enough success that they're able to close the base in Malta and move their main base to Beirut. So this became the heart of the operation to spread corruption into the Muslim lands. This is in the 1860s now. So, and that occurred because they had already incited a war, kind of like a strife or a turmoil or, bloody massacres in that area between the Christians and the Muslims. And then the French sent warships, and then the British also sent their ships, and they said, we need to intervene to keep the peace. You must recognise this is we've seen that one quite a lot, haven't we? Peacekeepers coming in, who then turn into occupiers. So they came in and they started to occupy. Well, actually now the Khilafah was weak, and they were not able to, really resist this. And the Khalifa accepted them to occupy that part of the land under special conditions, to put it under a special protectorate. But ultimately, Lebanon was born. It became an independent state, or a more or less autonomous state. You've got parts of the Muslim lands breaking away from each other. You had the Egyptians breaking away from the Uthmani Khilafah at the same time. So the weakness of the Muslim state was kind of evident at that time. But Catherine, of Russia, Catherine the Great, I think they call her, 1762, she invaded the area we know as Crimea today. Sebastopol, they set it up. That was when they created that state, the city called Sebastopol. What was the other one? They called it Azov. These are all very familiar names now. Odessa. These are the areas that they occupied. They took it from the Muslims. These are Muslim lands ruled by Muslims, the Ottomans. They took it and they set it up as part of Russia, which is why the whole Russian war today, they claim it as part of Russia, because they remember Russia, Catherine, was the one who took it from the Ottomans. So they're kind of the first Europeans to take land, serious amounts of land. But it just started a domino effect. Napoleon, around the same time, 30 years later rather, he attacked Egypt, seized it. He moved into Palestine, seized it. He didn't last long, but he exposed the weakness of the Ottomans, because the Europeans suddenly have got technology. They've got weaponry, which the Ottomans didn't have. So suddenly they're coming with something and they're challenging them seriously. The Europeans encouraged, they set off revolutions in the Balkan region, so they managed to get independence for most of the Balkan region. 1878. Greeks was in 1830 obtained their all of the 1800s, the 19th century. This period was when many of these countries in the Balkan region were calling for independence from the Ottoman state. They had been conquered previously. They had remained Muslim for 200 years, but not all the people had accepted Islam. Why? Because Islam hadn't really been applied effectively. Islam existed in the legislature, but people didn't feel the dawah, it didn't consolidate Islam in the region. So many non-Muslims remained, and the Europeans were able to employ them to call for independence. The French seized Algeria in 1830, then Tunisia in 1881, then Morocco in 1912, Italy seized Libya in 1911, Britain occupied Aden in the edge of what's it called, Yemen, 1839, 1882. They captured Egypt, 1889 Sudan, and then of course the First World War, and then Britain occupied even Istanbul, Palestine, and that's it, that's the end. So you can see very rapidly towards the end, the Europeans are just conquering. But they had, those early conquests in the 1800s, they established bases, they established their missionary societies, but the missionary societies transformed. They realized missionary was useless. They're not converting, they weren't aiming to convert people to Christianity. They changed their whole approach. And they started creating, non-sectarian, what do they call them, scientific societies, cultural societies, Arab societies, art societies. And they went through many of these. They would flourish and they would die. They would flourish, they would die. Until they started to get one or two, until they started to have Christians, Druze, Muslims, all in the same societies. And they started to, while in there, they're ostensibly meeting to discuss science, but in reality they're talking about, oh, those Turks, they're really problematic, aren't they? You're Arabs, you should have your own science. Why are you allowing the Turks to hold you back? And they're doing the same thing in the Turkish lands and saying, those Arabs, they're just a burden. Why are you allowing those backward Arabs? The sand, they're desert Arabs, they're useless. They don't have the advanced thinking of the Turk. And so they're using this technique to encourage nationalistic feelings, to encourage this breakaway, to the point where they established many societies. I got a quote here from a British consular agent in Jeddah in 1882 wrote back to the government in England, and he said, "I understand that some people, even in Mecca itself, started to adopt the idea of liberation. It spread. It wasn't focused and isolated on what was going on in Lebanon. It wasn't just that. That was just the nucleus. And from there it spread through many parts of the Arab lands. The idea of liberation from the khilafah, of rebellion, and vice versa, of dumping the burden of the Arabs from the Turks, this really spread. And this is what ultimately led to the demise. So that spreading of false ideas, of the idea of division, is ultimately what led to the end of the khilafah. But they also interfered in the education system. They interfered in the way Islam would be taught. It was taught as a religion, like Hinduism, like Buddhism, like Christianity, like Judaism. It was devoid of its political aspect. The seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was taught as a historical topic, as a history of a great man, like the other great men in history, like all the other philosophers and thinkers, Confucius and various other people. It denied him his status as a great leader, as the leader of a civilization. They denied that, and they started to try. One of the tricks they played was to tell the Muslims that the Western civilization was really just borrowed from the Muslim civilization. That Western, all they did was take from Islam the best bits and just adapt it. Now you still hear to this day, many Muslims are very proud, they really wave this flag, and they're they love to tell you, oh, don't you know that the Westerners, they just took Islam from us, there's legislation to take them from us. The reality is the Muslims today have taken their legislation from all of the Western legislature, from the French Penal Code, from the British, civil law. But they did this, they told this lie in order to propagate this idea that Islam is just this, it is just this universal beneficial, set of legislation. It's rationally derived. It's just something that any human being could agree with. Meaning it's no longer linked to the Aqidah. It's just a useful, beneficial legislature. And therefore they implanted the idea that Islam accepts anything which is in agreement with Islam. So whether it comes from France or Britain, doesn't matter. If it's okay with Islam, you can have it. It's no problem. Which is very, very different to saying this rule, this thing is right or wrong because the Quran said it's right or wrong. Rather, you say, well, I didn't find anything in the Quran and Sunnah to say this isn't right or wrong, so it must be okay, because I didn't find anything to deny it. And that's a very different way of thinking. One way makes the Quran the basis, the other way just says, well, I had a quick flip through the pages, and I didn't see anything problem there. Yeah, democracy is fine. Of course, it looks just like Shura. No problem. And that is the way they implanted these false ideas in. And of course, this is the Western education. It didn't stop at, many Muslims were invited to Western universities. They set up their own schools and universities and missionary schools, English medium schools within our lands, French medium schools within our lands. And the products was a whole class of Muslims who always managed to find themselves into the bureaucracy and the leadership and the professionals. They were always promoted as the successful ones, but they had an absolute disdain for Islam. They saw Islam as backward, even though they're Muslims. But they say the Muslims are backward. Islam is what holds us back. We need to adopt the Western way of thinking, modern way of thinking. We need to be nationalistic. We need to be patriotic. This is the modern way of thinking. Islam held us back. But now we can, advance just like the Europeans are advancing. But they didn't realize the Europeans are advancing for a very different reason. It's a lie that their advancement is based upon these ideas and Islam and you remaining Muslim. No. It's because they adopted a complete whole ideology, consistent belief, which we don't believe in, but they had a consistent belief which all the people believed in and they all worked together for. Whereas the Muslims, they kept on to the Islamic belief, but they took some of these ideas, disparate ideas from the Western countries. And this is what was propagated and pumped into the Muslims to the point where now you got the main movers and shakers, the main players in Muslim lands, the rulers and all of the entourage of the rulers, all of those who occupy the parliaments, they are from this way of thinking. And everybody else is seen as backward. And everybody else is now expected to toe the line. So you got the Muslim ulama at the same time, because they had lost the ability to do ijtihad, a group of them came out and said, no, everything Western is forbidden. Everything Western is backwards. We need to rebuild the Islamic Ummah on a spiritual basis. It's because we're un-Islamic, because we do sins, that's why we're failing. That's why the British are winning. So we need to go back to that purification of the soul. And then you had the other group who said, no, it was Islam that held us back. And of course, they're the ones who win. They're the ones who took the power. They're the ones who got into all the positions of power. Because the other group said, in order to be religious, we have to deny involvement in the dunya. We have to not get involved in politics. Politics is what corrupts us. We need to focus on spending time in the masjid. We need to purify ourselves spiritually and so on and so forth. And you can see those people still exist today. Those people who are in the power generally are completely uneducated with Islam. They don't have the first, they don't know their left and right when it comes to Islam. And they usually have a complete backward hatred for Islam, even though they don't like to admit it. But in reality, you grill them, you find they're just seething. They dislike the backwardness that they attribute to Islam. And they see Maulvis, Maulanas as backward people. And of course, that image has been promoted through the media. And then you've got the other group, very, very individualistic, do nothing for the society. And they hold the Ummah back because people say, I'm any Muslim in his life who'll go through phases, but at some point he's going to become religious, he's going to start to remember he's going to die, he's going to start to turn back to Islam, he's going to go to the Maulvis and Maulanas who are going to tell him stay away from politics. Become spiritual, just focus on your individual affairs. Don't get involved in all of that nonsense. And so therefore you find that who's holding the Ummah back? It's two people. One is the corrupt politicians who dislike Islam and don't understand the deen, and you've got the educated in Islam, Maulvis, Maulanas, whatever you want to call them, ulama, who hold the Muslims back from doing the one thing which would change the situation, which is correct the corrupt politicians. So the corrupt politicians get a free rein to do what they want, and the spiritual people say, don't correct them, even if they make major mistakes and so on. You focus on yourself. You be selfish. You don't worry about anybody else. And that brings us neatly to today. That's where we are still today. So in order to reverse all of this, we have to understand the thing that made the Ummah great right from the beginning. The strength of the Ummah was its unity in its reference point. Unity in its Aqidah. The Aqidah wasn't just this academic word that they memorized. The Aqidah was a reference point. It said the Quran is the truth. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam brought the truth. We need to refer back to that if we want to be successful in this life and in the Akhirah. So we need to spread that idea. We need to go back to it all the time. We need to take all of our solutions for life's problems from the Quran and the Sunnah. That was the strength of the Muslim Ummah of the early Muslims. They built that state so strong that it lasted for 1400 years, even though it deserved to have crumbled long before then because of neglect. But there was nobody to come along and challenge it. So it just stayed there. Even with the neglect, it just stayed there. But when somebody did challenge it, it crumbled very, very fast. So now the Muslims, if we want to come back, we need to understand that first point. But we need to identify the two main dangers in Ummah. Yes, the disbelievers, yes, the Western states are the ones who attack us and keep coming with these new attacks and this new creativity to corrupt us. But ultimately, they won't succeed unless they've got somebody who listens to them. So it's the Muslim Ummah, there are people in the Ummah who still continue to be infatuated by the West, or whoever happens to be, the dominant power of the day. They're still infatuated. They still look to the West for their solutions. They still think all economic policies have to come from some Western economist. They still believe that is the goose that laid the golden egg is sitting there in London or in Washington or somewhere else. They are the main cause of our problem, but the main cause of us not being able to correct these people is the ulama who tell us, don't correct them, don't get involved, don't have any participation policy, you stay away from all of that. So we have a double-edged problem. Ultimately, our solution lies in changing the politicians, but we have to first have the ability or the desire to want to change them. Firstly, we have to desire changing the politicians, and then we have to go about the work of actually changing them. And if you change those politicians, make them robust politicians, people who are not infatuated with the West, people who have the ability to resist and refute the Western ideas, people who have the ability to expose and show the corruption that comes from the West and the strength of Islam, and have the confidence to refer back to Islam, then we solve the problem. The Ummah's problem is solved once again, and we become like the Sahaba. Because the Sahaba, that's all they were brought with, wasn't it? That's all they had. Yes, they were pure. Yes, they were spiritually sincere. But ultimately, their strength came because they had this strong belief that Islam is not just a spiritual Aqidah, it's a spiritual and political Aqidah. It's an Aqidah which solves the problems for all of mankind, everywhere in the world, all the way to the Day of Judgment. And they had that strength of character and belief, and they made sure it was implemented. And that is the task that we have to focus our minds on if we wish to reverse this decline. أقول قولي هذا استغفر الله لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين. 1300 years in half an hour.
Can I just quickly, because we are recording the session, so can I just quickly summarize this in Urdu? Very quickly, because I want to share the video in Pakistan. So brothers, Brother Yahya has quickly gone through the reasons. तो अभी जो कुछ points मैं highlight करना चाह रहा हूँ, वो points हैं कि मुसलमानों का जो decline है ये over the period of time है, और ये शुरू हुआ immediately after नबी सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम की वफ़ात के बाद, और हमने देखा कि ये उस वक़्त तक जब 1923-24 के अंदर जब तक खिलाफत ख़त्म हुई उस वक़्त तक ये डिक्लाइन जो है ये चलता रहा. तो उसके मेन रीजंस क्या थे, मैं उसको सिर्फ 5-6 पॉइंट्स क्विकली समराइज करूंगा, और फिर उसके बाद अब इसको जो रिवाइवल है उसके लिए हमें क्या करना है उन पॉइंट्स को मैं क्विकली हाईलाइट करना चाह रहा हूँ. तो सबसे पहले जो बात की हमारे स्पीकर ने कि हमने बेसिकली इस्लाम को एज अ अकीदा और रेफरेंस पॉइंट जो है वो समझना छोड़ दिया, और हमारी जो समझ है उसके अंदर एक डिक्लाइन आया, और इस्लाम जो है वो सिर्फ जो है एक नज़रिए के बजाय एक इबादत का और मामलात का मजमुआ समझना शुरू कर दिया हमने. और इसके अलावा जो है हमारे जो उस वक़्त की हमारी हिस्ट्री है कि हमें फतूहात मिलना शुरू हुई, और हमने देखा कि उमैय्यद के बाद अब्बासियत का दौर आया, और अब्बासियत के दौर के अंदर जो फोकस था सारा वो बेसिकली जो है वो रूलरशिप को प्रोटेक्शन की तरफ करने पे हो गया, जिसकी वजह से एक जो फतूहात का सिलसिला था वो रुक गया फॉर टाइम. और उसी वजह से जो है एक मुसलमानों के अंदर एक जवाल आना शुरू हुआ, क्योंकि जो बेसिकली लालच थी या जो आप कहें कि मटीरियलिज्म था उसमें इजाफा शुरू हुआ, और लोग दे वर मोर फोकस्ड ऑन के जो حکومت ہے اس کو کس طریقے سے بچایا جائے. اور اسی تناظر میں پھر ہم نے دیکھا کہ 3 مختلف جو ہے وہ خلافتیں وجود میں آ گئی کہ ایک طرف امیت سے ایک طرف عباسیت سے پھر فاطمیت سے اور یہ ایک آپس میں کمپیٹ کر رہے تھے. تو اس دور سے ہم آگے چلتے ہیں تو اس کے بعد کیا ہوا کہ ایک ریوائول آیا اللہ تعالیٰ کی طرف سے اور آٹومنس جو خلافت ہے وہ قائم ہوئی. یہ اس دور میں ہوئی جب مغرب جو تھا وہاں پہ رینیسنس آ رہا تھا, وہاں پہ بھی سوچ جو تھی وہ تبدیل ہو رہی تھی. اور اس سوچ کی تبدیلی کی وجہ سے کہ ایک مسلمانوں کو پھر ایک کمپٹیشن ملنا شروع ہوا, کیونکہ اس سے پہلے تک مسلمان جو تھے وہ آئیڈیولوجیکلی اور ملٹری وائز جو تھے وی ور دا سپریم پاور, وی ور دا سپر پاورز. تو لیکن جب یہ ایک کانفلکٹ جب ہمیں چیلنج بننا شروع ہوا تو اس کے اندر ایک یہ جو آئیڈیالوجی تھی جو کہ مغرب کے اندر سیکولرزم کی بنیاد پہ تھی, جہاں پہ ڈیلینیٹ ہو گیا تھا میٹیریل جو انسان کی بینگ ہے اور جو اس کی اسپریچول بینگ ہے, کیونکہ اس کے اندر ایک جو یہاں پہ ایک سوچ آئی کہ یہ دونوں جو ہیں یہ الگ ہو چکے ہیں. اسی بنیاد کو جو یہ جو آئیڈیالوجی تھی یہ مسلمانوں کے اندر بھی سیپ ان ہوئی اور اس کی وجہ سے جو ہمارا مین عقیدہ تھا اس کے اندر دراڑ پڑ گئی. تو ایک یہ پھر ہمارے اسپیکر نے بات کی کہ دس واز اندر ریزن. پھر ہم نے ایک بات کی کہ عربک لینگویج جو ہے اس کو ہم نے چھوڑ دیا. عربک لینگویج جو ہے اس کی وجہ سے اس کو جو ہے وہ اسٹیٹ کی لینگویج کا درجہ حاصل نہیں رہا, اور وہ لینگویج جو تھی اس کے چھوڑنے کی وجہ سے اجتہاد کا عمل رک گیا. کیونکہ جب پھر لوگوں نے اور علماء کے درمیان جو اسٹیٹ کی لینگویج ہے وہ عربک نہیں رہی اور وہ پرشین میں اور ٹرکس میں اور باقی جو لینگویجز تھیں ان کے اندر ڈیوائڈ ہو گئی, تو اس کی وجہ سے تو جو ہماری بیس تھی وہ کمزور ہو گئی. تو لینگویج جو ہے عربک لینگویج جو ہے اس کا ایک وہ بہت بڑی وجہ بنی. فلاسفی کے تھرو جو ہے وہ اٹیکس ہوئے, اور پھر ہماری جو یونٹی تھی وہ امپیکٹ ہوئی مختلف خلافت کی وجہ سے جو کہ میں نے بات کی. پھر یورپینز جو تھے انہوں نے سیپ ان کیا, بیکاز جب اسٹیٹ کمزور ہوئی تو مشنریز کے تھرو جو ہے یورپینز جو ہے انہوں نے انویٹ کیا اور اپنی ایک آئیڈیالوجیکل جو ہے وہ بیسز بنائیں, جس میں بیروت کا انہوں نے ذکر کیا کہ بیروت کی ایک پورا ایک ان کا سینٹر بنا which become the kind of a base جہاں سے انہوں نے نہ صرف اپنی دعویٰ کی بلکہ لبنان جو ہے وہ تھرو دی مشنریز اور جو ان کی فورن آکوپیشن فورسز تھی ان کے تھرو دے مینیج ٹو گیٹ انیکس کر لیا انہوں نے خلافت سے. اور اسی طریقے سے پھر جو بالکنز اور دوسرے علاقے تھے ان کو بھی آہستہ آہستہ اسی وجہ سے جو ہے وہ انیکس کر لیا گیا, الگ کر لیا گیا. تو اس کی وجہ سے جو ہے ہم نے دیکھا کہ آہستہ آہستہ آٹومنز جو تھے, کیونکہ ہماری عربک لینگویج اور عقیدے کی کمزوری کی وجہ سے علماء جو تھے وہ بھی اجتہاد کے عمل سے پیچھے ہٹ گئے, اور انہوں نے اس لینگویج کی وجہ سے نئے جو مسائل تھے ان کے اوپر اجتہاد کرنا بالکل ختم کر دیا, کیونکہ اس کی وجہ سے ڈفرینسز آ رہے تھے. تو اس کا انہوں نے حل یہ نکالا کہ اس کو جو ہے بالکل ختم کر دیا جائے. تو ہم نے اس کے بعد جو ہے یہ جو آئیڈیالوجی ہے یہ مغرب کے تھرو یہ انٹر ہوتی چلی گئی ہمارے خلافت کے اندر, اور ایسے لوگ جو ہے وہ پرومیننٹ پوزیشن حاصل کر گئے جو کہ مغربی سوچ کے حامل تھے, جو کہ سیکولرزم کو سلوشن سمجھتے تھے, اور ان کو جو ہے پروموٹ کیا گیا ایجوکیشن سسٹم کے تھرو. تو اور پھر ہم نے دیکھا کہ کمال اتاترک اور ینگ ٹرکس کی جو ایک موومنٹ چلی اس کے نتیجے میں 1924 کے اندر جو خلافت ہے وہ بالکل ختم ہو گئی. تو اس کے بعد ہمارے اسپیکر نے جو 2-3 پوائنٹس بات کی کہ اب یہ ریوائول جو ہے کہ اب یہ ہم واپس کس طریقے سے جائیں, ہم اس سٹیج پہ آج ہیں اور اب اس کے ہمیں واپسی جو ہے وہ کس طریقے سے ممکن ہے. تو سب سے پہلے میں بات کی کہ ہمیں عقیدہ کو اور اسلام کو اپنا ریفرنس پوائنٹ